Hitler's Nimble Steps from a Broken Germany to World War II. This lecture is about how Hitler approached starting the war that he wanted from the beginning of his rule. He knew that if he moved too quickly, that the countries around him, particularly France and Britain, which were the most powerful ones, and perhaps the Soviet Union, would have stopped him. And so he had to be very careful in building to the war that he wanted. And he was very clever and very meticulous in his approach to getting to a point where he had some hope of actually winning World War II. So this is about the steps he took, the very careful and nimble steps he took in order to start that war the way he wanted it, when he wanted it. The Treaty of Versailles is not really a step of Hitler's, but it definitely is something that Hitler could use in order to improve his power. The Treaty of Versailles had been imposed on Germany after World War I, and the Germans didn't have any input into that. And even though the United States did not particularly want to see Germany punished, and Woodrow Wilson, our president, had actually said as much, it was not to be. Germany and France, Great Britain and France did want Germany punished, and they mainly wanted Germany so severely weakened that they couldn't possibly threaten another war. Germany, as a result, was forced to pay massive reparations, which are cash penalties to fix past damages, to Great Britain and France. That had the benefit from the French and the British point of view of bankrupting Germany and making it almost impossible for them to start a war, they thought. And it also, in their minds, would bring in enough money that they could take care of people who've been harmed by the war and also improve their own finances since they had borrowed so much to do World War I. Germany's military was also limited during the treaty, which was good, but on the other hand, that meant that Germany was quite weak, and as Stalin's USSR was building up its power in the east, that meant that Germans were quite nervous about the threat from the Soviet Union and felt like, especially before Hitler took power, like, why shouldn't they have an army that they could use to defend themselves? So that was obviously a point that Hitler could use later on. There was also a lot of territory taken from Germany after World War I, and so there were ethnic Germans who were in other countries. Most of them were very happy to be in those other countries once Hitler took power, but it was something that Hitler could talk about as a thing that needed to be changed. So in many ways, the Treaty of Versailles, although Hitler didn't do it, was a huge thing that Hitler could use in order to build his popularity with the Germans. Another key element of European politics that Hitler could build on was the rise of the USSR and communism in general in Europe. So obviously Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky had led the Bolshevik Party to take over Russia during World War I. In 1917 that started, and then by 1922 the Bolsheviks had won the Russian Civil War. And so you had this big, powerful USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, off to the east, which was a threat to everybody in Europe, in particular democratic countries, and Germany was one of those at the time. And you also had the rise of communist parties throughout the rest of Europe, so in France, Britain, Italy, all over the place, Germany included. And those communist parties and the threat of Soviet communism were definitely something that Germans worried a lot about. And that was something that Hitler then could use, again, as a kind of a drum to beat on. He could say that he alone could save Germany from communism. And even Germans who really did think Hitler was kind of creepy and inappropriate as a leader did believe that he was a person who was deeply anti-communist and could be trusted to stop communism, even if they hated him personally and hated his beliefs. Hitler's first personal step to taking power was actually a total failure. In 1923, he attempted to take over Austria with his Nazi party, and that failed badly. It was a thing called the Beer Hall Putsch, which is a coup, a seizure of power that's illegal, that he tried, he and his Nazi friends. They failed, and they were arrested. Hitler was, however, pretty popular with some well-connected people and a lot of people in the police and some of the people in the military. And as a result, he wasn't punished terribly, and he was allowed like a typewriter in prison and all kinds of benefits that a normal prisoner wouldn't get, which gave him time and the ability to write his book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which is a really badly organized and terrible book, aside from being nuts. But in Mein Kampf, Hitler does lay out his whole plan for, starting a war, attacking the Jews, all those other things. And he never was shy about what he wanted to do. People knew what his plans were. But having a book obviously is helpful for a politician. It made him seem a little less like a street thug and more like a kind of thoughtful statesman thinker. And so, in a weird way, failing at a coup and then spending some time in prison writing a book turned out to be quite helpful for Hitler. And the thing that really made Hitler possible was the Great Depression. In 1929, the Great Depression began, started in the United States with the stock market crash. There were a lot of things that went into the Great Depression, which we studied in class already, so I'm not going to go over them here too much. But Germany, which was already in a bad situation because of the reparations payments around the Treaty of Versailles and the collapse of its economy after World War I, and a lot of dead German men, who were the working class at that point, Germany was in real trouble, and the Great Depression just made things even worse. And Germany was one of the countries that was most brutally impacted by the Great Depression. People lost their jobs, the currency of Germany, the mark, collapsed in value entirely, people's life savings were destroyed, it wasn't even clear how the economy could recover. And so the Great Depression kind of forced Germans to make a choice. Did they want to go communist? Because that was a very big, powerful party, although a lot of Germans were very afraid, correctly, of communism. And yet they also had as their other key option Hitler. And the depressing part is there was nobody in between those two who was large enough to actually, meaning politically powerful enough, to actually run Germany without the support of either the communists or the Nazis, which made Germany politically impossible to rule without bringing Hitler in. And without the Great Depression, that never would have happened, and Hitler never would have become Chancellor of Germany, and therefore World War I and the Holocaust would not have happened. Period. One of the things when you're thinking about World War II is we tend to sometimes think of it as a European event. The Germans invade Poland, and then, the Russian War and all the other stuff. But a huge part of World War II and the beginning of World War II began in Asia. And the Japanese seizure of Manchuria in 1931 began this struggle that would effectively be World War II. I mean, it's arguable that this is when World War II started, so it would be a 14-year-long war. However, the Japanese-Chinese War that began here was not technically a world war, so it was kind of the war that morphed into and joined World War II, or the Europeans joined the Japanese-Chinese War, which would be a better way to think of it. But the Japanese were also heavily impacted by the Great Depression. Nobody wanted to buy their stuff, and they were an industrial power. And they were also cut off from a lot of resources by countries that were turning very inward during the Great Depression. And so in order to kind of fix their economy, and because China was very weak and the Japanese were very militaristic and imperialistic, the Japanese decided that it was in their best interest to seize Manchuria, which is northern China. And they believed correctly that the rest of the world would not stop them, and that China was too weak to stop them. And so that is something that happened to the Chinese that began what would be a nightmarish 3 to 4 decades of horror in China that the world sat by and watched the Japanese do. This was very helpful for Hitler, however, because he now had effectively an ally in Asia, because the Japanese were causing the Americans and the French and the British a lot of tension, and that was moving those forces to Asia and therefore away from opposing Hitler. And it also kind of took the heat off of Hitler, like he was more of a sideshow compared to the very ongoing war in Japan. And so that was a benefit for Hitler that the Japanese, totally unintentionally, ended up providing. And Hitler was a clever politician, and he navigated the Great Depression and the political collapse of Germany extremely efficiently. There was, as I said, in Germany during this period, no single party powerful enough or popular enough in their representation in the Reichstag, or the German democratic government, to actually rule the country without including either the Nazis or the fascists. And Hitler, by this point, had kind of toned down some of his rhetoric. He had written his book, and he kind of sold himself as the guy who could be worked with. He wasn't a communist, and since Stalin actually was running the Soviet Union very terribly, a lot of Germans felt like, Hitler is a thug and a bad guy, but he's not as bad as Stalin. And that was a terrible, terrible mistake that people in Germany made. And one thing that's super important to point out here is that the communists also did, aside from just providing a bad example that helped Hitler gain power, the German communists in particular could have forestalled Hitler. They could have kept him out of power. Had the German communists been willing to work with more moderate Germans, centrist Germans, and not demanded very extreme things, then the people in the center of the German government might have been willing to work with the communists, and therefore Hitler would not have had an opportunity to come to power. But the communists, the German communists, and Stalin himself, who was giving the orders, did believe at this point that there was going to be a violent revolution in Germany, and they thought the communists would win it. And so they were perfectly happy to see Hitler take power because they felt that he would create a revolution that communism would win eventually, which was a miscalculation by the communists in Germany, by Stalin, and also by German centrist politicians. And the winner of all of that on January 20th, 1933 was Adolf Hitler, who was made legal chancellor of Germany. He did not even have to seize power in a coup the way a normal fascist would. They chose him because they were more afraid of the communists than they were of him. And as the late 30s or the mid 30s go on, the fascist governments and the militarist government of Japan, which by the way is not fascist, it's something else, it's militarist. A lot of things that are bad, but it's not fascist. Italy joins the party in 1935, Hitler's nasty party, by deciding to take over Ethiopia, which was one of the few African countries that hadn't been conquered by the French and the British and various other imperialistic powers. And Italy basically and Mussolini were like, we need our own empire. So they attacked Ethiopia. And the League of Nations, which was kind of like a United Nations 1.0, a really stripped down basic version of the United Nations, did absolutely nothing. And Italy was allowed to attack Ethiopia with no limitations. Nobody helped Ethiopia. And that proved two very important things to Hitler and helped Hitler in a very big way. One, it like normalized war again, which was going to be helpful for Hitler. But it also showed that the League of Nations was completely toothless, that it wouldn't stop anyone, and therefore the kind of aggressive militarism that Hitler was interested in really was not going to be stopped by anyone. Nobody had the guts to do it. And that was a message to Hitler and something Hitler would take advantage of. Hitler's first big act of taking over Europe, I suppose, would be actually kind of a non-event that was important. Hitler decided to remilitarize an area called the Rhineland, which is basically a border region between France and Germany. It's within Germany, and the Germans were, according to the Treaty of Versailles, not allowed to move military forces there. The French wanted that in the Treaty of Versailles, so that way the Germans couldn't sneak attack them the way they had in World War I. And so this was a rule that said, until the treaty was over, Germans had paid their debts and stuff, that Germany just couldn't put troops in its own country, part of its own country. And Hitler basically made this calculation that the European countries opposing him, particularly the French and the British, were too afraid of another war, and they were all stuck in the Great Depression and broke anyway. And so that he could just move a few troops, which is all it really took, into the Rhineland, and that the French would blink, that they wouldn't actually declare war on him for doing that. Because in the end, if you're a French politician, you would have to explain to the French people that you're about to go to war, start a brand new world war. And the French very clearly remember the First World War, which was still being called the Great War back then because there hadn't been a Second World War. The French politicians could not probably have convinced the French people to attack Germany over Germany invading Germany. Like, it's just a hard argument to make. And so Hitler was allowed to remilitarize the Rhineland, which was a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which made German people feel like, wow, Hitler said he was going to break the treaty. We laughed at him. He broke the treaty. Nobody did anything. He's put Germany back together. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was an easy bet by Hitler, a tiny little step, a nimble step that he took that he was not punished for. Had he been punished, had the French attacked him, they clearly had the military force to defeat Germany. But it was a war that really wouldn't have made sense to start at the time, although in retrospect, that could have been the end of it all. It just didn't happen that way. Again in 1936, so adding to the tension, but also taking pressure away from Hitler, is the Spanish Civil War. So another fascist dictator, again in southern Europe, this guy, Generalissimo Francisco Franco of Spain, decided to seize power, seize control of Spain, and turn it into a fascist dictatorship. And no one, again, really wanted into this war. The democratic nations basically were busy trying to deal with the Great Depression. They were afraid they would accidentally start World War II. So Franco was allowed to take over his own country. For once, though, people did fight back, and in a major way. And this was a very brutal, long, violent civil war. The USSR, Stalin, by this point had realized how dangerous fascism was, and Stalin did send troops and forces to Spain to try and salvage the democratic Spanish Republic. The problem was by getting communist help, that just in a weird way helped the fascists, particularly because the democratic nations refused to work with Spain if they were working with Stalin, but then, nobody else was willing to help except for Stalin. And so this was really a failure of the United States, France, and Britain to support Spain against a dictatorship. And the really key part for Hitler and Mussolini was they were able to send troops, particularly tanks and aircraft, into Spain, into their civil war, and then practice. So Germany was careful and Italy was careful to send a lot of their troops in for short periods of time, see how tanks and aircraft connected by radio work together, all the things that would make them very successful in the early fighting in World War II. The Germans and the Italians could practice in Spain while nobody else did. And so German troops were up with the new technology. They knew how it worked, and most of them had been in combat, which is a crucial benefit when you actually have to fight. Having been in combat before makes you a better soldier if you don't get killed the first time. And again, since nobody stopped aggression, it became really normal. Like, people were like used to fascist takeovers. And so Hitler, just didn't seem that scary compared to what was already going on, and he was more militarily powerful as a result of the Spanish Civil War. And then World War II did begin. The Japanese invaded China, not just Manchuria, which they kind of seized, and then were fighting the Chinese. So that war never did really stop. But in 1937, the Japanese invaded China proper. And for the first time, you really had major heavy combat, because this war would go on until 1945, that really did basically morph directly into World War II. So I think pretty much at this point, every historian thinks that World War II started in China in 1937. And this fighting really helped Hitler because it forced Britain, France, the United States to shift troops and materials into Asia that otherwise would have been available in Europe to stop him. And the fact that there was just kind of an ongoing brutal war in China, and the Japanese did incredibly brutal things to the Chinese, including the rape of Nanjing. Those things made Hitler seem just normal. And the League of Nations couldn't do anything to stop it. And so once again, this step, although it wasn't Hitler's step, this was a Japanese step, definitely was a huge benefit to Hitler. And all of these things, as you can see, are now starting to really stack up. Like at the beginning, it's little things every year and a half or something. And now we're going like something major in the world every 6 months. And it was all over the place. So people who were opposed to fascism and militarism were bewildered and didn't know how to respond. And they were also stuck in the middle of the Great Depression. And that war in China pushed the Japanese into the arms of the clearly racist Germans and the Italians. And they, together, those three nations, formed the Axis Pact. Even though the Japanese technically weren't fascists, they were basically on the same side. And so these three nations signed a treaty which kind of put the rest of the world on record that they were in for a lot of trouble. These three very aggressive states that nobody was willing to stop were now on the same team. That was obviously a huge benefit for Hitler. And he was one of the people who really wanted this pact and treaty done so that he could guarantee and promise to his own people that if there were a larger war, he would have foreign support, Japanese and Italian support, particularly since those two countries had big militaries and had been successful up till now. So the Axis Pact made Hitler way more powerful. And then very soon after that, in 1938, he achieved Anschluss with Austria, which is unification with Austria. That was supposed to be illegal, according to the Treaty of Versailles. That was literally in the treaty. Germany can't do this thing, even though they're all ethnic Germans. It was said that these two countries couldn't combine. Hitler just said, "I'm going to do it." And a lot of Austrian Nazis, and there were a lot of Austrian Nazis, wanted that unification. And so basically there is it's hard to explain exactly what's going to go on here, so I'm not going to. But when Germany does take over Austria, it is a non-violent seizure of Austria. There were Austrian Nazis in the streets, as the German troops paraded in. Hitler's in an open convertible, obviously easy to assassinate if anyone had wanted to, but no one did. They're throwing roses at him, not grenades. And so when Hitler reunites these two countries, not only does it make Germany a lot more powerful and therefore more prestigious, but it completely invalidates the Treaty of Versailles, which, Hitler could now say, "See, I told you I was going to get rid of it, and I did, and no one stopped me. I am the most powerful person." And Germans were, many, many Germans, even people who didn't like Hitler at the beginning, were like, "Man, the guy knows how to deliver." And his opponents were completely demoralized. And then after that, Germany decided to seize what's called the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. And you can see the Sudetenland region right here in this German map. Sorry about the language there. And basically, this is all of the parts of Czechoslovakia where there were German minorities that had been made part of Czechoslovakia when the country was created after World War I, when Austria-Hungary was dismantled. And basically Hitler claimed that there were Germans trapped in these green areas on the map, and those Germans needed to be back in Germany because they were being discriminated against and all these other things in Czechoslovakia, which was totally untrue. It was also an illegal demand. You can't just demand parts of other countries. But the Czechs were not in a position really to oppose the Germans. Their army wasn't big enough, and they weren't sure how to stop it. So they appealed for help from their large allies, the British and the French, both of whom ended up abandoning them. Great Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went and visited Mr. Hitler, as he called him. They talked, and Neville Chamberlain became convinced that if the world gave in and gave the Sudetenland to Germany, if Germany was appeased, allowed to take what they wanted, that then Hitler would be done. He would have gotten his last demand and everything could go back to normal. And Neville Chamberlain famously said that this would guarantee peace in our time, which was, of course, nonsense, and it destroyed his political career. But, of course, with Britain refusing to fight, then France would have been fighting Germany alone. They weren't sure they could win. They didn't think it was worth the trouble. And so Czechoslovakia was just abandoned. Hitler was allowed to take the Sudetenland. And once again, Germany got effectively free land, and Hitler looked like a genius to the German people. He was bringing all the Germans back into Germany. Nobody was stopping him. Everybody else was confused. And so the seizure of the Sudetenland was a step that Hitler took that really did make him much, much more powerful. And right a month before the war started, World War II, in Europe, the really shocking thing happened for the rest of the world that wasn't the Germans and the USSR or Stalin, and that is that in August of 1939, the Germans, or Hitler's people, I think it's Ribbentrop maybe, or Molotov, I can't remember. I think Molotov's a Russian guy. They signed a non-aggression treaty, which means a treaty not to fight. And that treaty untied Hitler's hands. For once, he now knew that he could go attack France, he could attack Poland, and he didn't have to worry about, like in World War I, having to fight a two-front war, which had ruined the Germans in World War I. So Hitler now knew that, like, basically Stalin wasn't going to attack him from the east, which would allow him to put his whole army against the French later on when he wanted to. And the funny part is both these guys were thieves. They were both criminals. They were both monsters, Stalin and Hitler. And they knew they were going to go to war. They hated each other. They were like polar opposites. The whole point of fascism is anti-communism, and the communists really hated the fascists. But these two dictators just kind of realized, like, if we work together for the first part of the war, we can get a lot of what we want. Like, Stalin wanted part of Poland, he wanted the Baltic states, he wanted part of Romania, and he knew that if he didn't have to worry about fighting Hitler, he could just take all this stuff. And then Hitler had made the same calculation that he could get a bunch of stuff and possibly defeat France and Britain. And then both dictators thought, okay, now we'll go to war later on. But in the short term, let's get our own issues dealt with. And so the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact really opened the door for Hitler to start World War II in a way that even the German military, which did not want Hitler's war, felt like, damn, we might actually have a chance at winning this thing. And so this treaty really does begin World War II in Europe because it makes it safe for Hitler to try that. And then within days of signing that, Hitler makes the final demand that he makes that will start World War II. He demands a city called Danzig or Gdansk. It's the German pronunciation is Danzig. The real pronunciation, the one that's stuck historically, is Gdansk. It's a Polish city. But there was a German minority living there, and it had been part of Germany before. It had been taken away from them after World War I. Hitler basically says, I need this piece of territory from Poland, which was, by the way, Poland's only access to the sea, and therefore it would have crippled Poland economically to lose this city. But Germany says, like, I need this city. I'm going to take it. It divides Germany in half. They're Germans there. I have to help them. All the same stuff you've been saying about Austria and the Sudetenland. For once, though, Britain and France did finally say, if you do this thing, we will go to war with you. And they were serious. And everybody knew they were serious. So this really was the beginning of World War II. It was just Hitler announcing it was going to happen. He didn't really expect this step or this gamble to pay off. He kind of knew that this one would start World War II. And so they immediately began in Germany preparing to dismantle Poland. At the same time, the Soviets were planning the exact same thing because they were going to meet up in the middle. And so this is kind of the event that will start World War II, is the seizure of the Polish corridor. So Germany begins the European version of World War II on September 1st, 1939, when they invade Poland. So they had prepared for that after they were not given Gdansk, Danzig, the Polish corridor, and they begin to invade from all sides Poland. At the same time, Stalin and the Russians are invading from the east, so Poland just collapsed, and this began the war that would only end in 1945. And at the same time, remember, of course, that the Japanese are fighting already for 2 years in China, and there's a horrifying war going on there that will now expand into Europe and thus be a world war. And this is what Hitler had planned for. He had done all this work since World War I and had taken all these careful little steps and had made some crazy gambles, each of which had paid off. And Germany was in a position to maybe win, although honestly they had no chance. But Hitler didn't know that, and the people around him were too afraid to tell him no, and so World War II did begin.